Energy is inherently a part of everything we do in our lives, but one of the least understood things.
By giving people agency around their energy, around power, you are giving them power.
This is a moment in time with technological advancement that allows for humans to take advantage of the free aspect of energy.
I can see a future where there is limitless and free energy. And that's a pretty beautiful world to live in.
Welcome back to another episode of Power to the People. This episode, we got Rob, we got Derek, and it's going to be a good one. I would love to start with you guys. It's a very interesting concept. So I've been familiar with EVs for quite a while now. I remember when the Model Y first came out. I actually ended up renting it to go on a road trip to California for a film shoot. And I remember just being like, okay, I'm going to test this EV infrastructure. How will it work? And this was November. Drove through the desert between, Vegas and California, and you do that whole drive through there. And a lot of stuff went wrong. Air conditioner didn't work. Battery charging was a bad experience. Just all of it was kind of a mess. And for a little bit, I was like, man, is this really the solution? And then, you fast forward and like the infrastructure is kind of built. I want to start with both of you, and whoever wants to go first. What was kind of your first experience with kind of just the electrification concept? Like, where did it all start with EVs?
I had it was interesting from my perspective, right? Because I've always been a fan of, yes, there's all of the things that we know are good about EVs, at the broader scale, right? Specifically environmental consciousness, right? But I've always just inherently been a fan of things that are done in a smarter, better way, right? And so if you just look at the comparing an internal combustion motor, which was really, I mean, they've become so amazing over time. But yet, if you compare that with the performance of an electric motor and just how many fewer moving parts there are, less maintenance, I mean, probably an 8-year-old could look at the two things if you kind of broke it down and go, yeah, that one seems way more advanced, way smarter, right? And so our first experience was we got one of those first. There was a super great deal on the BMW i3, I think it was
No
called.
way, you guys had one on the i3?
Yeah, it was this little tiny little, and we test drove it, and it was like the funnest car to drive ever. It was like a go-kart, and I was like, I don't care, all the other stuff is great, but like this thing is fun to drive, and that was my first experience. And so we got it for Karina. But what I wanted to touch on real quick before I pass to Rob is the idea fundamentally, I think, for all of us, and maybe even for those that were driving the market, was that you plug in at home, and that you don't have to go to gas stations. You just plug in at night at home, and it charges overnight. The car only had 90 miles range, and overnight you charge the whole, you charge it all the way up. And the way we looked at it, like our average drive on a day-to-day basis, that was more than enough, right, for Karina and the kids and whatever. And so that I think is interesting as context for like where things have evolved, in that if you look at the idea of just being able to plug your car into your house at night at the lowest rate, overnight, and now drive on that energy, was incredibly dynamic. Like there's just a lot to that that's really, really powerful. Now, certainly as you look at the market at scale, not everybody has the ability to do that. Maybe in an apartment building, whatever it is, right? You just can't, and so the market has evolved into offering or needing to create infrastructure out there that allows people to charge. Now, not all of us remember to plug in at night, even if we can, or maybe we've come to realize it might be cheaper somehow, some way to plug into a station somewhere. But I think for me, that idea, just at its core, was you have this vehicle that drives like a race car, go-kart kind of thing, that everything was modern and light and super different with the screen. And it was just like a totally different vehicle, different driving experience. And it was clean, environmentally sound for the most part. And you charge it by just plugging in at night. Like that was like, what the hell is going on? So I think remembering how this came to bear, in the market originally, and that concept is like really important to understand where we're at now, and this kind of this broader adoption. And therefore need for infrastructure out there.
Hmm. Rob, what about you?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in a similar way, I think definitely appreciated all of the more macro, impactful ideas around electrification. And like, if we speak of electrification beyond vehicles, I mean, you're talking about this idea that if we electrify, we can then decarbonize. That was a lot of what was driving the whole thing, at least from a macro sense. It was like, you can't, it's harder to decarbonize fossil fuels than it is electricity. And so that's one of the like driving factors behind why we would want to shift, have this kind of mass adoption towards electrification of transportation, being that that is one of the major sources of pollution, emissions, GHG, greenhouse gases. And so, but like Derek, I think the initial kind of like aha or like light bulb or just reason why I wanted to drive it was because it was a better vehicle. Like once you got in, you were like, this is just a better vehicle. This is a better technology. It's more efficient. It's funner to drive. You can charge it home. Like, just like Derek said, that was a huge factor, I think, in the adoption. Yes, there are all these macro factors, but I think when it came down to it, people chose electric because of those more personal reasons. And
Hmm.
I think now we are in this spot where the adoption has happened, at least on a personal side, and now we're trying to move into that more macro mass adoption commercialization of this electrified paradigm. And we are starting to have to deal with those issues of, how do people charge if they live in an apartment building? How do fleets charge if they're used to buying a bunch of diesel, or just giving gas cards to their employees? How do you change that whole mindset? How do you give electric vehicles to your employees so that they can charge at home? Do you set them up so they can charge at home? What if they live in apartment buildings? How do they charge? Do you give them, do you set up your own infrastructure system? Do you have them charge at work? Can you charge at work? How do you do that? And so all of those things start to play into this, this crazy, multivariable kind of, um, like superstructure of transportation and energy. And all of a sudden it becomes a pretty complex puzzle to solve for. Um, and that's where I think, at least where my head goes, is how do we solve for that, and be a facilitator to go to that next step beyond just personal charging at home? How do we now help businesses charge their fleets? How do we help people that can't charge at home charge? And like, where's the infrastructure for this next paradigm, this next wave of electrified transportation?
I think a lot of it though is that adoption of, I guess, the mindset of how to operate under that. Because I don't know if you guys ran into the same problem of like the total range anxiety. I mean, I think we all experience it a little bit when like the phone decides to start to give up its battery, where you're like halfway through the day and you're like, man, battery's low. But then for some reason, when you're operating a vehicle, it's like, oh, battery's low. I'm going to be on the side of the road. What do I do?
Yeah. Yeah.
Was it a hard adoption rate to that side of
But that's
things?
to me why I think Tesla took off. I mean, obviously there's so many factors that made Tesla and the Model 3 really the big one. It was like,
Hmm.
you had the original Roadster that was like super aspirational. It was like if you drove a Porsche 911 and you wanted the newfangled thing, you got it in one of those Roadsters or whatever. But it wasn't for the average bear. And then the S came out, which was, I think, a smart move in that they were like, oh, so let's use this aspirational thing to build a market, meaning not everybody's going to buy this Model S. It's a luxury car. It's expensive.
Yeah.
It's big. It's solid. It's like if you drive a Mercedes S class or whatever, like this, you're going to feel at home in this thing. And so we all watched that happen. Very few of us were like, yeah, let's go spend 100 grand on a car, right? Like it was just kind of like watching it. And it became this thing where the people with affluence and the people that had the means were buying these things because they were a sick car, right? Like if you think about how close the time window was between what I remember as electric vehicles was the freaking Nissan Leaf, dude.
Yeah.
You remember that thing? Like I was like, I like that's the ugliest thing I've ever seen. It's slow, it's clunky, it's just
Yeah.
whatever. And then not that far down the road is the Model S, where you're like, what the hell is this thing? I remember a writer described it as Beyonce in a lounge chair, is what the shape of that thing looked like. That was the analogy. And I was like, that's kind of a cool
Yeah,
analogy,
it had
right?
the hips. It
So
was all
yeah,
chill.
just
Yeah.
have that like, picture, Beyonce in a chaise lounge. You're like, that's the car, right? So a lot different than the Leaf. But I think what's interesting though is why the Model 3 took off like it did was all of the things that are obvious for sure that we don't need to go into. But one thing that was unique was the Tesla had built the infrastructure along in parallel with the car, and all the things that went into building, the ecosystem that commercializes a car, right? The supply chain, the factories, the labor, all the things, the engineering. But at the same time, they built this infrastructure. But the key factor was they gave you the mapping so that range anxiety became so much more diminished in that you got in, plugged in the address you're going to, and it's going to tell you when and where to stop. Like to me, that was the fundamental breakthrough in mass adoption in EV is that without that, so yes, you have to have the infrastructure. Yes, you have to have a car that people want to drive. But the idea that those of us that could and would and wanted to drive that car now got to say, look, I know exactly how to get from point A to point B. It's mapped out for me. So that I think gets easily like glazed over in conversation around mass adoption of EV is that mapping tool of planning your trip and where to charge and for how long and all of those things, how many stalls are open, all that stuff, what amenities might be near that charging station. So you can even plan your lunch along with your charge. Like all of that was just, I think, one of the biggest breakthroughs.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, and it shows how important tech was to that. I mean, really without, if it had happened 10 years before that, you wouldn't have all of that, all of the ability to actually map things out. You wouldn't have those kind of like Google mapping capabilities. Tesla had their own mapping, but the idea of that didn't exist. And so you just took it for granted that there were gas stations everywhere, and you drove around. You were like, "There's going to be a gas station. I'm not worried about it." And if you are on this crazy drive in the middle of the desert, you're like, "All right, I got to get gas here because I know there's not going to be a gas station for the next 100 miles." But in EVs, you were like, without that kind of mapping capability, without that tech, you were kind of just out there. You're like, if I didn't charge enough at home, I don't know where I'm at. So, that, and the Leafs also, those original cars also had minimal range. I mean, you're talking about 100-mile range. So the Model 3 came out, it was this like, sexy looking vehicle. It was fun to drive. It had 250 miles of range, and it had this tech in it. And Tesla had already built out this pretty substantial, robust infrastructure, all, in certain states, not across the country yet, but in certain states where the adoption was high enough. And you kind of got in that car and you pretty much felt like range anxiety was a thing of the past. It wasn't really an issue anymore.
But dude, in contrast, Rob, think about this though. At some point, way back when, before there was a gas station on every corner, you probably did have to kind of plan and map your travel, in the 1940s or
Oh,
whatever, right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
And so, but here's what's interesting though.
But you
This is
didn't really
my
travel.
point on this. Yeah, this is my point on this though. That over time, the demand grew, so did the infrastructure, gas stations themselves, right? And then getting the gas stations, all of that, to where nobody even really thinks about it. There's like, as long as I map, like if I look at my map of wherever I'm going pre iPhone, you still knew that anytime I could get to a city, I got 250 miles of range, whatever. If I get to that city, there's a gas station. I just know it, right? Well, I think that we're looking at a near future around that with EV too, right? To where that tech for early adoption, where you can map your charges, was so important to get people out there buying those cars. But there's not that far down the road. I think we're going to just be able to go, I don't need to do that. I can just go because I know that there's charging stations at every shopping center, anywhere that I go, right? So you're going to be looking at the same way that people once looked at gas stations. As long as I make it to that town, I know there's a charging station. There's probably 10. I don't need to worry about it, right? So I think we're in this kind of inflection point of change here, where what was necessary to gain traction, market bite, we will become a ubiquity down the road, and that mapping tool is not as important, and so therefore I think we're going to see a more mainstreaming of EV over time, as long as the infrastructure keeps being built and the demand stays there. And I think that it'll be interesting to see what happens when some of these incentives are removed. And I do believe that there's enough people out there going, it's a better car to drive. Look at your, cost of ownership, the fact that, all these things that like one person's just telling their friend, like, dude, it's just a freaking better car to drive. It's, and it's a better thing to own, that I think that there's enough traction now to where it's going to continue forward.
That's what I was kind of thinking about was, I mean, even thinking about this whole process of adoption of EVs, I almost went immediately back to that Ford time. It's like cars then became a little bit easier to, I mean, they became more accessible, kind of bottom up strategy. Like, let's give everybody a car and then build the infrastructure, and then everybody will have a gas station, but you still had to plan your trips. Car design had to be in a way where people were attracted to the new thing. I think over the last 30 years, cars are just utilities at this point. They're boxes with wheels, and we go from point A to point B. But I think what EV is kind of enabled is almost this new industrial revolution of, whether it be car design, infrastructure, motor design, everything is changing. Um, when do you think that? When do you guys think it's going to stabilize? I think is the better question, because you do have the infrastructure and you have the demand, but like, are we like 20 years to when everyone's like, oh yeah, pull into everything, or is it like a future we see soon?
I think it's sort of dependent on where you live on the planet. I think you're already seeing pretty kind of much like that ubiquity in Europe, in China. I think, America's sort of falling behind at this point. A lot of that's policy driven, but we've kind of hit this somewhat of a speed bump in terms of reaching that point. There's a lot of just political kind of culture war kind of stuff that's impeding our, I think, growth into that spot. Whereas,
Do you think it was like our choice of infrastructure? Because I always wonder about that, of like, you have a lot of European cities or more, they have their metropolitan and then their rural, and then we have metropolitan, suburb, rural, and that middle one requires everybody to have a vehicle realistically to kind of get where you need to go, because we
we
didn't
Yeah, I
are
do
was going
that.
to
definitely
say
way
I
more
was going to say
car-centric.
there's interesting, thing that I've noticed. I don't know what the data is on it, but along with the push into EV became a big push into things like biking, right? Where it's like people are starting to say, wait, it isn't like inherently important that I have to have a vehicle if really I'm riding from my suburban, spot to my downtown office, and I can throw on a backpack or, have some little bags on my bike and just get my groceries on the way home or whatever. And I think that shift, yes, it was partly due to pandemic. There was all kinds of factors, but it seems to me that it does kind of, I bet the data shows that it does kind of go in parallel with the adoption of EV, where I think people were questioning transportation in total, and where it was a little bit like, wait, they're getting this eye-opening thing to like, wait, it's pretty inefficient to drive this, gas powered vehicle with just me in it, the 10 miles back and forth that I go every day, when I really could just bike, and obviously there's limiting factors around weather and things like that, but it does seem like we're in a paradigm shift just around what's possible, and why we do things is a little bit more of a question these days versus maybe the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, where it was a little bit like, no, this is how you do it. Um, so
Yeah, I think the suburban
yeah,
sprawl thing is sort of an American problem more than it is European or Chinese or other places. It's more prevalent here, and so I think that did drive a lot of our infrastructure decisions for sure. And I hate there's a reason why they give out those stickers for EVs so that you can drive in the high occupancy vehicle lane. So it's like, hey, everyone carpool. Hey, everyone, if you don't carpool, at least get an electric car. And so that's how they're kind of incentivizing people to do those things, similar to, yeah, like let's make safer bike lanes. Let's give people access to ways to get from their house to the urban centers. There's even a push to move, I mean, just generally to move people demographically into the cities, whereas there was a lot of that kind of urban flight in the 80s, 90s, or maybe even the early 2000s. But now there's this kind of move back into how do we make things more efficient. There's also just a lack of, and this is partly due to the fact that we did drive so hard at gas-powered vehicles, is the lack of public transportation infrastructure in this country. Totally different. Again, Europe, China, some other countries have insane mass transit systems that link everything to everything. We only have really one city in this country that has a robust mass transit infrastructure system. Every other city is just like, get in your car, drive around the town, 5 miles an hour, just waste gas, super inefficient, right?
Well, you grew up East Coast. So I
did.
mean, there's a lot of people in New York who've never driven before and never have a license.
Don't have a driver's license.
Yeah. So lifestyle difference, now that you live West Coast, grew up East Coast, what was that difference?
It was huge. I mean, I had to basically be mapping out my transportation. Like for a while I lived in San Francisco, which was decent, but I had to use my car. I mean, public transportation was terrible in San Francisco. It would take me over an hour to get from my house, which was 5 miles away from downtown. I mean, I worked downtown. It would take me an hour and 15 minutes to take a bus to a train to another bus. I could bike, and that would also take 45 minutes. But I would sometimes just get in my car, and it would take maybe 25, 30 minutes, and you're driving through trafficy streets and it's painful, and you can't really, it's harder to pay attention and do work that I could do maybe sitting on a bus or a train. But yeah, getting used to that and having to get in a car to do really pretty much anything, very different. Yeah, very different experience.
Derek, do you think that's like the
California-
tipping point, if you will? Because I'm hearing that it's kind of more like convenience and or ease. So the ease of adoption of whether it be EV or electrification or just a new way of doing something, is the function that we're looking at here.
You're talking about there's a pretty dynamic problem here, right? So on one hand, you go, why was there less effort put into public transit infrastructure and so much effort put into the auto industry? And if you look at really who pulled the strings behind the scenes in this country's growth over that industrial growth era, it was, the people in control of capital also controlled all of the oil and gas, right? And so for them, if you look at things like the textile industry or auto industry, what was the primary driver behind that? It was extreme, beyond, capitalistic kind of mindset of some of these folks that were driving industry so for their own benefit, right? So if you look at why cotton not hemp, or you look at why auto not subway, there was a reason behind that. And so that's a fundamental bedrock to why things evolved the way they did. Now we're seeing, I think a little bit more of I think along with the internet became a decentralization of information as well, right? So some of those guys also owned your main source of media, right? Now, that's still the case in legacy media, but we're starting to see this more ubiquity in information and understanding of things, right? So now we're seeing a little bit more public awareness around choice. And so to some extent, yes, I think the adoption is it was interesting to me just spending time in like a very, traditional oil and gas kind of, red state like Tennessee. People aren't anti-EV. It's more so just that they're going for what I've got to do on a day-to-day basis, haul my hay, my tractor, whatever, all that stuff. It's just not quite there yet. But I, in lots of conversations out there, I wasn't hearing a lot of like, oh, FEV. My grandpa worked in the coal industry, and they're like, dude, my grandpa died because he worked in the coal, industry, right? And so they're not opposed to it. They're more just of like coming from a standpoint of what their viewpoint is, a little bit more of like what is helping keep American jobs protected, what is helping to keep, their industry going, right? And so I think the media tends to show it as like, oh, these people are just anti-EV. They're more just like pro, how do I run my farm, right? So it's like, and so I don't know. I mean, that's obviously a subjective viewpoint that I have of just my experience. But the truth is I think that there's not a lot holding back a broader adoption. than just the access, right? So to Rob's point, the infrastructure that we think in California is so robust is very nascent in other states, and but I don't think there's different reasons for different people around why EV. But I'll tell you what, you drive a Ford Lightning, if you've been driving an F-150 for its general purposes, there's no question in your mind that the Lightning is a better truck, right? For general truck purposes. It's just better.
Mhm.
There's no question, right? And I love, in our area, contractors tend to be like kind of set in their ways, right? They do things based on the way that their dad did it or their grandpa did it or whatever, right? And I'm watching all these contractors driving around, Lightnings these days, and I'm like, this is incredible. I didn't
If you
think that
weren't
they
in
would
this
move.
industry, would you be buying one?
Yeah, I mean,
Because
the
you
only
come
reason
from a
I don't
contracting background.
Totally. Yeah, I 100% first choice would have driven it, and there was only a couple factors that kept me from getting it. And that was the fact that I tow things, and there's so few pull-through charging stations yet, right? And so
Mhm.
that was going to really, and it sucks because it's just a handful, a small percentage of my annual time in a vehicle. But those times are important to me. That's family time that I'm towing a boat or whatever,
Mhm.
where I'm going to go spend one of 3 weeks that I get to spend with my kids a year, and like not being able to do that effectively was a challenge. But that said, I would hands down drive a Lightning. I mean, to me, it's like for my life, that's the best vehicle on the road, right? And I think that there's a lot of folks that think that, or beginning to think that are more traditional people that aren't just like gung ho environmentalists and clean energy
Definitely.
folks. They're just like, dude, I don't have to change the oil on my truck. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like,
it's a better, they're just realizing that it's a better economic decision. It's a more
yeah,
efficient decision. It's less dealing with
the brakes last longer. You don't have to
everything.
change the oil. I mean, on and oh, you have the front. I mean, you can't believe how many like, kind of more of that traditional Sunday football American love the Lightning because of that front. I mean, it's
Yep.
so useful, right? Because typically you'd have to get a camper shell to be able
Sweet
to lock things in
tailgating.
your truck. Now you can lock stuff. So anyway, the point is that I don't think there's as much headwind on an adoption standpoint
Yeah.
as one might imagine. I think it's more just that we think we're way further down the road than most Americans because we're in this industry. But I
Mhm.
think that there's actually a very strong push in, or a pull, market pull, that yes, we've got some political headwinds and some incentives and things that change things. But I mean, if you look at what Ford did to transition all of their factories over to, building electric, they can't just pivot on that. They're gonna keep going. So that means without the incentives, they're gonna need to make even more compelling vehicles, right? Because you've got to sell somebody on this is a better vehicle, regardless of your, it's like it becomes more of a true apples to apples comparison, right? So I think it's going to drive um, even more innovation in the space on the vehicles, and I think it's going to drive even more folks to want to build the infrastructure.
Well, I was wondering that about the just the innovation and the infrastructure across the board. I mean, I think now at this point we're starting to get to a point where there is there's enough EV awareness, there's enough demand, there's enough just demand for a shift in energy. Is it now about making a damn good product, or is it about innovating a good product? Because I think there's a certain, like the iPhone, for example, just to take something completely out of context, has more or less been the same for like the last 9 years. It's like literally just whatever, a new glass, a new camera, whatever, same thing. They had that innovation jump, and then it was like ride that and refine. Are we at the innovation jump? Are we in it still, or
I think
where
there's gonna
where do you think we're at?
I think there is going to be an innovation jump in the battery technology for sure. There's a lot of really smart people working on this, and so I think we'll see some kind of like pretty significant improvement in battery efficiency and power density at some point in the next 2 to 3 years, I'm guessing. But I really do think it is mostly a mindset thing. It's a paradigm shift in how you understand mobility and
Mm,
how you understand your actual need. Like I think the range anxiety thing was the wrong problem. That's what I really think. And I think we've all kind of like been subject to that. And I think that the consumer base has sort of like driven this range anxiety thing. And then the car manufacturers are also kind of playing it back to them and there's been this race to like have the most
The
range,
most mileage. Yeah.
you know, and it's just like, that's to me the wrong problem. That's not where we need to be focused. I think the idea, like Derek's saying, he's got a truck, an ICE vehicle, internal combustion engine vehicle, and he's got an EV. Most of the driving he does, and him and Karina, that, you know, they're driving around town. They're driving a few miles at a time, and so that's perfect for an EV. But sometimes we want to go on a long drive, and so changing that vehicle to EV, maybe it doesn't happen now. Maybe you wait. Maybe you never do it. But that doesn't need to happen as much. 99% of all the driving we all do is perfect for EV, and it's just around town, and it's just a few miles, and you don't need 400 miles in your battery to do that, especially if you're charging at home. And even if you're not, you only have to charge in one place once a week. Like, it's the wrong problem, right? We're focused on the wrong thing. It's how do we shift our mindset into understanding that now we aren't reliant on this other fuel, this other centralized source that's like, you know, geopolitically controlled. We now have the ability to take.
That's the power of the people right there. That's where Rob takes things. It's brilliant, right? Is this idea that it's the principles behind it that really are important, right? It's the idea that the power construct, the thing that really controls what we consume and how we live our lives, is piped into us through access to the fuel, through the headlines in the newspapers, to whatever, right? The jobs that are available. And what's happening now is we're creating choice. We're creating ubiquity in information, understanding choice, and truly creating decentralization, which is truly giving power back to the people, both literally and figuratively. That, I think, is what is the most inspiring part of all this to me. You know, I had the luxury of taking a Harvard Business School online class about business innovation, right? And one of the parts of the class was talking about the arc of innovation on any given segment, and that once you see innovation begin to flatline a little bit, right? So to your point, the iPhone 14 to 15 to 16, it very little. I mean, I would take somebody's, you know, far more technically savvy than me to even understand the difference, really. So what tends to happen is that signals a full paradigm shift. That's signaling something's going to come out that maybe means the phone doesn't even exist as a phone as we know it to be, right? Like, this thing looks totally different than what our grandparents thought of as a phone. They would call this a personal computer, right? And yet we call it a phone. We're going to see communication change, in my opinion, to where the phone, the thing that we call a phone, which is a personal computer, at the most extreme level of personal, is maybe outmoded completely. However, where you see innovation in the way you and I might talk about it, which is how good is the camera, or what's the storage, or how user interface, how good does that work, so on, where the next big advancement, maybe to what Rob's point was, is just, what if you had a phone that lasted a week without a charge? Just out of like not having to think about it, right? But also, to Rob's point, does that really even freaking matter? I sit at my desk most of the day and I just plug the thing in. It's not that big a deal, right? I can go anywhere and just plug the thing in for 10 minutes and I got charged. It's not a big deal. So that isn't really the big issue to solve. But I would argue that, you know, in some of those technological advancement, innovation, you get this steep curve and it hits this really, wow, every year is this breakthrough, and then it starts to flatline, and that's typically a signal, you know, that we're going to see a complete paradigm shift around what we think that thing should be used for, or how it shows up in our lives.
Well, I think a lot of this too,
and it tends to be some form of decentralization, right? It tends to be some form of what was centralized and only Apple knows how to do this, to all of a sudden it's like all kinds of stuff's popping up everywhere. And
well,
that's
I think
what we're
you
seeing
get
in
people
energy.
curious across like education. I mean, for example, like we pay our power bill. You know, this is like one of the first times I really opened it up and like looked at the whole thing. And it was like how you compare to other houses and all that kind of stuff. And I'm in this industry, and it's like most people they don't think or even look at
experts
energy.
in this industry don't even know how to break down a
Exactly,
bill. Bro,
exactly.
It's intentionally meant to be
exactly.
confusing.
It's super confusing, and it was like you use this many kilowatts of energy. Here's what your similar homes use, but here's where we think you are, and you're still just kind of on the mediocre side. I'm like, I actually am pretty good at this. But of course you can always be better and improve, but it doesn't necessarily say how. There's no context around it. I just feel there's like a complete lack of understanding of like, if you turn the light switch on, how much does that cost? Like I think there's a currency, and I don't mean specific to money. I just think there's a misunderstanding of how do we make sense of energy. It just is like this thing that works, but we don't really have a way to equalize. I mean, Rob, we talked about previously like the whole concept of kilowatt,
Right.
at a gas station. But now how does it look like on a bigger scale where they're just like, well, I pay this for energy. Oh, it went up 5 cents a kilowatt. What does that mean though? And I think there's a lack of understanding.
Dude, I grew up in a household, where we were like not paycheck to paycheck. My parents were entrepreneurs, so it was like sale to sale, basically. But it was like it's so beat into my head. Growing up, it was like my dad would go around turning off lights, like just
Oh
turning off
yeah.
lights and like snapping on us for like leaving lights on, and like. And I remember one time I got in my, when you get into that rebellious age of like whatever, I was in my mid teens, and I was like, Dad, you're talking about like 5 cents throughout the whole month. Like I could leave this light on all month and it would be like five. Like, are you really spending your time doing this? And that was my argument, right? Whether it was
Yep.
informed or not. It was just kind of this like pushback on like, dude. And it's funny because, I come from the building science and the energy efficiency background. That's kind of where I spent my time. And, the idea when LEDs came out and you compared the amount of energy being used by an LED light and the amount of light and coming out of that one fixture, in comparison, it almost made that whole argument around how much does energy cost or how much, how often are you leaving that line on, almost kind of took that flatline that equation.
Mhm.
And then I think, you can't have this conversation without talking about where energy is going at that large, infrastructure scale, with small modular reactors and things like that conjoined with, site generated power and that whole ecosystem of power, and it's shifting back and forth and how it's being utilized, almost to the point in theory we could see energy costs if the right people or the wrong people don't get their arms too tightly wrapped around it. We could see energy costs dropping radically over the next 10 years. Obviously, that has a lot to do with who's in control of how it all goes down.
So then do you think it's about solving it in the background for the consumer rather than the consumer getting totally read up on everything? Because I always wonder about
Dude,
like that side. Where's the balance between it all?
don't we go back to first principles to some extent, though? Do what's best, do what's right. Like, just do
Yeah.
what makes the most sense. Innovate, right?
Yeah.
Like, always be driving to what's better and what's possible.
Yeah.
And then, yes, to some extent, the chips fall where they may. And at the same time, though, we're having some of these political conversations too around who's controlling all this. And like, in California, if you look at the political spectrum and it's how closely tied to the, utilities commission it is, right? And like how nepotistic that whole thing is. And like, who's really in charge and who's like, is it really, a public,
Mhm.
or is it
Utility.
still corporatocracy at its best, yeah, that's a dynamic question for sure.
But I do think it is up to innovators, entrepreneurs, industry leader to
For sure.
consumers are not going to be able to solve for that.
They don't know what. Remember what Ford? I love this quote from Henry Ford. He said, "If I was to go ask the market what they wanted, they would just tell me faster horses." Right. So
Mhm.
you have to almost be driving innovation for innovation's sake to some extent.
Mhm.
And like it's a little bit from my perspective, it's kind of one of those things where it reminds me of growing up playing sports where the kids would be arguing about who got more playtime or whatever on in the game. And I had a coach at one point who said, dude, you you can't stop greatness, right? Like you want court time, be the best, like be undeniable. I can't not put you on the court. You're arguing about why you should get more playtime, but it should just be like a foregone conclusion, right? So I think that's that same
Mhm.
way in like technological advancements. Like go create. That was like a Steve Jobs kind of mindset, was just go
Mhm.
create greatness, and then the market cannot not do it. Like it has to come to bear, right? And so I think that we're kind of arguing over these little nuances and details about what should we force people to do. I'm like, dude, people go take that dude and drop him in a Ford Lightning and have him tell you that
Yeah.
that's not a better truck, right? Like,
I think we started, yeah.
just
People are going to recognize. I mean, you see, the Model 3 was the Model 3, and it was so successful for a reason. It wasn't because they were forced to buy them. It was like, this is a better fucking
worked.
vehicle. Go drive that thing. Just getting it. You're
Yeah,
gonna want one.
my dad was he's been a car guy my whole life. I grew up around cars, and that was kind of actually one of the harder things of the EV side. I was like, my God, the sound of a really, really incredibly well built
Sound.
car is
Fuck
going
yeah.
away. Like there's
But
something about that like
Rob made a great.
coolness.
I think it's easy to miss Rob's point. He had a kind of a undertone to a point that wasn't overt, which is honestly, if you're gonna drive that freaking crazy rad sounding '69 Camaro fucking 10 miles a week, are you really doing like? I mean, that
Exactly.
thing was built 50 years ago.
Yeah.
Keep your
Right? It
69
was
Camaro.
built 50 years ago. It's already a sunk cost, and all the things.
Mhm.
And then your 10 miles a week that you go rip that thing just to get your rocks off is not, you're not killing the environment. It's the commuting every day, all day long,
Exactly.
so I love that Rob's point there is that like, dude, it's not necessarily that that's bad and this is good. It's just consider the bigger picture of it all, right?
Yep.
And again, it's like
That's
that.
where
I
we need
think
to
it's
help
lost.
guide. Yeah, that's kind of where we need to guide the consumer base on a macro
Yeah.
level. It's understanding that, making that
Well,
mind shift change.
yeah,
It's like,
he
Like
went
you're
through
not
like
a
Camaro.
jerk for having your
Camaro.
old freaking classic car or even your Ferrari for that matter, right? Like
no.
it's just you're a jerk if you drive freaking 50 miles a day in some you go out and buy some total like hog like that. There's no that you don't need, right? By the way, can you guys tell me if this rumor's true? I heard somewhere recently that Ferrari switched over to all electric. That Ferrari did. And I was like, no fucking way, right? To me, I would
I
have
think
never guessed that.
I didn't hear all electric, but I do know that they do have an electric F1. Like they have an electric.
Oh, they do, right? But
Yeah.
I heard that they were going all electric. And to
That's
me,
crazy.
there's two thoughts that went through my head, right? One is, oh, that's impossible. The second thought was like, wait, that is kind of a Ferrari modality, which is how to create the best freaking thing possible on Earth. And
Mhm.
there's no way to argue that they can make a lighter, faster, more exciting car to drive with an electric motor than they could with any. They've reached the max on performance of an ICE engine.
I don't know.
So it actually kind of made sense. You know what I mean? I was like, wait,
Koenigsegg just set a record last week. Not even kidding.
Yeah.
And they integrated electronic technology into a. So I think what's so interesting is, and Derek, why you brought this up and why I think it's great is like, you're allowing people to kind of choose their own adventure of what works best for them. And then as much as like your everyday commuter, for example, is solving the problem that needs to get solved. Like my dad, for example, being a car guy his whole life, you tell him to drive anything but a Tesla now, and he'll be like, "You're out of your mind, man! Like I'm going to the grave with this car.
Yeah.
Like this is the way forward."
Yeah.
And he's been around cars his whole life, and like that, it clicked in his brain, and it had nothing to do with the planet. It was just like he went, "This is a better car,
Well,
therefore it solves my problem."
Yeah.
So I can make the argument as a car guy, growing up around hot rods and loud stuff my whole life. I can tell you that there is this moment in time where you miss that sound and that vibration, right?
Mhm.
However, it didn't take me long in the performance Model Y to actually fall in love with the silence of acceleration. There's
Mhm.
something that is unnaturally unique about accelerating 0 to 60 in 3 seconds silently, right? And so I actually found myself falling in love with that to where now that loud kind of thing is actually like it doesn't have the same appeal to me as like the ability to like essentially time jump into the future in silence. Like it's crazy, So I think that again, it's just paradigm shift. At some point, what we were all in love with it at one point is now you look back and go, gross, right? So I just think it's time and reps.
Well, and when
to make that shift.
for the rest of the like kind of electrical grid, I'm not sure if you guys have experienced where, the power just goes out and you have that moment of like, I heard the energy and now I don't hear the energy hum. How much do we not realize energy is like the underpinning of everything? Because a lot of people are saying like water, food, obviously important to fuel ourselves. But now I'd argue that like you throw in food, water, energy, like that energy is one of those like key things
Make
that
the
I think we all
analogy to
rely
the
on.
sun.
Yeah, I mean, energy is kind of behind both of those things. I mean, everything comes from the sun.
Yeah, if you equate energy to the sun, then you go like this: food and water don't exist without the sun, right? You woke up one day and the sun didn't come out that day, you're not finding food and water, right? Like if you go back to the cave days, right? So to some extent, it is almost foundational to all of it, as Rob just said, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think we do take it for granted. And like you're saying, very few people really even take the time to understand the nuances of energy, even in their own house. Like that in itself is just a confusing. You could spend your whole life trying to figure out how you spend your money and resources in your own house and how that relates to energy. And then you're adding, yeah, if you're adding your electric cars and solar and battery and all these things, like that's super complex for a consumer to break down.
Uh,
Then imagine that at like a commercial scale or utility scale, managing energy.
one
It's just like this insanely complex thing that's under
one thing that
everything that everyone does. Like that's
I think that there's also that we're starting to move into an area of, or at least an information age where people are starting to understand things differently. Um, Isaiah Taylor, I'm drawing a blank on the name of his company, but
Valor, Valor
Valor, right?
Atomic.
Nuclear. He explained this in a really, I think, profound way. He might be one of the best minds out there right now, young guy. But what he said is like, if you look at fossil fuels, or really what they are is more than anything is stored energy. And so what we're talking about that changes things or that makes the everything work is the ability to store energy or transport energy, it to be used in different ways. And so if you look at, like, we think of fossil fuels as this liquid, this like kind of liquid gold, or this ability to, like, it is the thing that either drives the ability to make electricity at that macro level, or it's the way that we can move around in our vehicles. But at the end of the day, really all you're looking at in that gallon of gas is stored energy potential.
Right.
And so why I think that battery storage is so important is for that very purpose, your ability to store it. And so it's not that it needs to be used at the same time that it's generated. And that's the interesting thing that I think we're going to see more and more change occurring around the idea that energy can be stored and utilized in different ways. As
It's funny because
opposed
fossil
to
fuels themselves are just ancient solar
stored
energy
sun, right?
stored.
Mhm.
It is compacted stored sun, right? Yeah, exactly. And so is thermal, you know what I mean? All of those things. But at the end of the day, the transportability, though,
Mhm.
and this is where I felt like Isaiah Taylor's point was incredible, was that you're never going to see lithium ion be as pound for pound effective as transporting some version of a combustion fuel, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And so his point was use clean energy to create new clean transportable combustible fuels, right?
Mhm.
So for instance, you're never going to see a battery rocket go to the moon. I think that was his example, right? So again, it's starting to become this interplay where it's less about A or B, it's A and B and C and D and E and F, right? And that's what I think is the shift that we're in right now.
Yeah. And I think back to your point, Derek, about like your dad saying, "Hey, turn the lights off." And this, I think in the 70s, 80s, 90s, up until pretty recently, actually, this idea of conservation and efficiency was so prevalent in terms of how we can help the grid, help ourselves from using too much energy. We knew, kind of this idea of peak oil, or we're going to run out of fuel, we're going to run out of energy. This whole thing, how are we going to do it, has shifted recently, very recently, into this idea of abundance,
Mhm.
right? Like, how do we, instead of going around switching the light bulbs off, understand that there is abundance, that we can actually tap into things like the sun, nuclear, other things, and create this abundance where we don't have to worry so much about turning our light bulbs off. It's like we now have an abundant source of energy, and it's unlimited and it's free. That's a totally different mindset.
See, I
Well,
always thought it was the light
brilliant.
bulbs itself. Like, I always thought it was when I used to get scolded for, leaving the light on, I looked up and
Worried about
was
the
like,
light burning out. Yeah.
light burning out. And because when I was my grandfather, when they sold their first home and moved to Santa Cruz, he took his light bulbs out of his old house and brought them to the new house. He's like, they bought the house, they didn't buy the light bulbs. And it was, and it was kind of like this funny thing in the moment of like, wow, that must have been a weird experience to like go and no lights. But
dude, in his lifetime,
it was the value of the light bulb itself. It was like, this provides energy.
In his lifetime, that was a breakthrough technology that you don't just leave behind, dude.
Yeah, so he's like, yeah, we're taking this.
It's limited light. Yeah.
To Rob's point, though, we don't have enough time to get this esoteric, but I would make the argument, and I would tell the cows come home, that the mindset shift from lack and limitation to abundance is the number one issue at all levels for the thrive, and it is the issue, right, behind all human existence and life on this planet, right? It's the idea that we're operating from a scarcity mindset that drives the ultra beyond capitalistic fucking mind, things that we see done. And this, like, it's just the greed and all that. As soon as you can create a new baseline understanding within humanity that is more of an abundant mindset, that there's more than enough for everybody, and that we all win better if we share that there's not even a sharing, there's just enough for everybody, and that we build systems that are based in that thinking, everything changes, like everything, right? And so Rob's talking about energy, and being free, ubiquitous energy changes the way we function in every aspect of our lives. But I say that it's even at the core, something that I think we in this company should be espousing more, is the idea of just shifting from scarcity to abundance in mindset, in just how we show up in the world, how we communicate with each other. That it is fundamental. I think you could go back to spiritual principles that even talk about this, just that idea that we are already enough, that there is already enough, that this thing, if we were to operate as if there's no limit and no need to control, the planet would be cleaner, everything would be better, right? So I think that's an underlying thing that kind of we glaze over kind of easily, but just if we can start operating in the innovation and the way that we think about markets coming from that abundance mindset, dude, it's game changing. Like that is, like, honestly, that's like my religion. You know what I mean? Like, love and abundance, dude. Like that, just start with that, and dude, game over, right? We change the world.
We can. I think that also speaks to, Steve, what you were asking about, like I don't know if you put it this way, but like, whose job is it? And it's all of ours, right? Like, and
Ours.
It's our job. It's the consumers and the entrepreneurs. It's the business leaders, and it's all of us. And energy is an incredible way to share information in a way. It's an incredible conduit. It's funny that, conduit is literally the way you send energy, but it is, right? I mean, it is the pathway between us all. It connects us all figuratively and literally. And so that energy of abundance really does, to Derek's point, it's beyond energy like in photons and electrons. It's the energy of everything. And if we're all connected on that plane, and this is getting pretty esoteric for sure, pretty deep, but like, it's true. It is true. I mean, like, that's the thing.
But here's I do. When you say ours, I agree with you 100%. It's everybody's. However, I do think that we carry a certain burden, this group, right? The kind of collective minds that we have here that are all aligned on a mission, which is to some extent to change the world for the better, right? We have the we have the ability to make real change, right? Those of us in business that have taken away the blinders of profit over everything, that have taken away the blinders of being important on a personal level or company level, and just saying, we don't really care if we get the recognition. We just want to be the spark to the revolution. Like that thing, to me, I feel like we do have a burden to take it to the next level, to go as far as it can go. Like, I feel like we at this company are less worried about our personal outcome than we are about how big an impact we can create, not just for the people that work in this company, but the people we serve in the market, but the world in general. And like, if we live by that ethos, like, the sky's the limit. It's guys like us, not to compare us with the brilliance of like, an Isaiah Taylor, but to some extent, that does exist here, right?
Mhm.
And guys like him, and love him or hate him, Musk and what he's done to change the world, and like there's we do carry that, I guess, requirement to take it
Mhm.
as far as we possibly can, because that is the thing that gets people thinking, right? Like
Mhm.
I've always believed in the idea you may not be in fact, I don't necessarily like the idea of being the biggest in any one thing that you do, because typically you're confined at that point by things like profit or whatever.
Mhm.
But be that thing that sparks it, man, sparks the change, that informs the change. And so I think we have that here. Um, and yeah, we have the privilege of having a good idea that brought together really brilliant people. And yet, what do we do with that? It's like that old parable from the scriptures of like, given you talents, and what did you do? One kid buries them and says, "I'm going to save them." The other one says, "I'm going to go, you know, go share it, spend it, whatever." Like I feel like we have that
Mhm.
requirement here to do that.
Yeah,
Well, and I
I
think.
mean, I think you're talking about like a certain, like a responsibility almost.
Mhm.
Responsibility is the word
Yeah.
I
kept
do
not thinking of.
I do agree. Yeah, I feel it.
Yeah.
I feel that like most of my life, I have felt responsible to use that, whatever it is. And
Mhm.
yet I think we all kind of have that feeling here of this, like, yeah, this responsibility to share what we have. There's a greater purpose here. Yeah. And I think sharing that and enabling that is, I feel responsible to do it
Well, and I think that
regardless of my
responsibility
personal
is a.
outcome. I think, like we've been talking about though, just like you said, like the best, like if you're the best, you're going to be on the court. If you've got the best tech, it's going to be what people buy. It's going to be what people use. So our personal outcomes are going to be amazing if we're
They're just
doing
results.
right
Yeah.
as a result of us
Mhm.
doing the most amazing possible benefit, most positive thing. We're all going to benefit from that. And so
Yeah.
I have faith in that. And so if I'm
Well,
living into that,
I'd rather die broke knowing I changed the world than die rich, having kept it all closed behind, and that's really the difference between, if you look
Mhm.
historically, between these, you know, kind of business oligarchs to, what we're talking about here.
Mhm.
It's a stark shift in my mindset. I had to kind of personally let go of the paradigms around political modalities and positioning and that conversation, and just say what none of, like, that's for other people to decide.
Mhm.
Like, how does our technology, what we're trying to do, land politically for them? I don't give a shit. Honestly, what I'm interested in is what's better, what's best, how do we do what's next? Like, drive that innovation, drive that new uh, breakthrough, and let the chips fall where they might,
Mhm.
down the road, or how people perceive that. But certainly, you've got market conditions that are always changing. And you can blame politics, you can blame opinion, you can blame, but that's not real. What's real is, what is the smartest, best thing you can possibly be spending your time on in business? Go fucking do that. And that's where I land these days, is like, dude, what is the smartest thing that we could be doing at any given time? And for what purpose? As long as it's mission aligned, like, go do that,
Mhm.
and don't worry about the rest. It's just noise. It's just, it's all will be, you know, yesterday's news at some point. And so it's like, kind of just, it goes back to that innovation thing, and
Mhm.
that's where I feel like very strong about, like, are we pushing the envelope to what's possible,
Mhm.
um, and not worrying about anything else at the
Well, I
end of the
think
day,
that goes back
other
to
than,
the
does it
abundance
improve people's
mindset.
lives?
Like the abundance mindset, part of
Yeah.
that is like, we talk about this responsibility that I think we all feel, but at the same time, like it's not only a privilege, but it's an opportunity. I think when most of the time when you're said, "Oh, you are responsible for this," there's like an immediate reaction of like, "Oh no, that's like more weight on my shoulders." Whereas in reality, it's like, no, this is an opportunity actually to take this and carry it over here. And I think that shift, I mean, that changes the business side. It changes the way we live our lives. It ways we, work with other people. It changes literally everything. One tiny little mindset shift.
You guys, we all grew up with siblings, right? And
Mhm.
so you remember, when you're a kid, you're like comparing the fairness of your,
Always.
with your sibling, right?
Mhm.
And I remember this hard talk my dad had to have with me, where he was like, "Look, you're different.
Yeah.
You both have greatness in different ways." And my job is to support that greatness, and it's going to show up differently, right? My job and it might look to you like I'm making it harder on you, but that's because that's what you need in order for your greatness to emerge, or whatever. And that conversation where it kind of was a light bulb moment where it's like, we all show up here in this world with different talents and potentials and capacities and so on. Are you maximizing yours is all that matters. Are you striving to bring, and so is this company doing that, right? Or are we worried about how we compare with the other company, or what the market says, or what the politics say, or whatever the BS out there? Or are we just taking what's our true potential and maximizing that? And that I think is an important thing to remember.
Nice. Well, on that note, I'm going to say that was a pretty incredible episode of Power to the People. Derek, Rob.
Power to the people.
Thank you. Till next episode.
Yeah, boys.
Do it.
Energy is inherently a part of everything we do in our lives, but one of the least understood things.
By giving people agency around their energy, around power, you are giving them power.
This is a moment in time with technological advancement that allows for humans to take advantage of the free aspect of energy.
I can see a future where there is limitless and free energy. And that's a pretty beautiful world to live in.